Hi guys, today I'm going to go through the COS3711 October-November 2023 past paper. Please note that this is the revised paper, not the original January-February 2023 paper that was repeated. That will be covered in a separate video. Before we look at the paper itself, just some obvious pointers that you should take note of before writing the exam. All COS3711 exams use IRIS, so make sure that you have IRIS installed beforehand and you know how to work it. Make sure it works on your computer prior to the exam. You don't want to have problems with that once you've started writing your exam. Also know where and how to access the exam script. You don't want to waste time on exam day trying to find the exam paper. No, make sure you know where it is and how to access it before the exam. The instructions on these exam papers are quite long. Do take a minute or two to read them carefully. They're generally usually the same, but you never know, there might be something slightly different in there, so just make sure you read and follow the instructions. Excuse me. Check the mark allocation. It's reasonably important. I'd suggest that you draw up a schedule based on the marks. The exam paper is usually 80 marks, which you have 2 hours for, which means that you should do roughly 20 marks worth of work every 30 minutes. So I suggest you draw up a schedule and try and stick to that. Don't go over time, otherwise you won't finish the paper. If there's a question that you're going over time with, rather leave it and move on to the next question, because generally you'll get more marks for starting a new question than you will to waste more time on a question that you're struggling with. You can always go back at the end once you've finished all the questions, but time management is quite important. Feedback from students in the past, that's the one item that quite a large number of students reported, is that they didn't finish the paper. So draw up a schedule and stick to it. Allocate your time for each question. Then the COS3711 exam generally has a scenario at the beginning, which can be in the form of text or a UML diagram or even code, although that's not very common. There is a new lecturer from this year, so I'd suggest that you do check with him that the format of the exam will continue to be similar to the past papers in future. But assuming that it is, there will be a scenario that you need to read through at the beginning and interpret that, and then answer the questions that follow. I'd really suggest that you allocate a few minutes to reading that scenario fairly carefully. Don't just rush through it and carry on, because if you misinterpret the scenario, it's going to affect your answers to most of the questions that follow. It's worth investing a few minutes at the beginning to make sure you read that scenario carefully and understand it. It'll help in answering all the questions that follow. Again, some obvious stuff. Remember, there's over 500 students in the class. The markers don't want to waste time trying to figure out which question you've answered or which answer is which part of which question, that kind of thing. So number your answers clearly, rule off after every question, leave space between lines, don't cramp things up. I see that most of you will be using a word processor, so it should be quite easy to get something neat. If you are using a word processor, you can save a couple of minutes in your exam by setting up a blank document beforehand. Set up a document with the module name and code, with your student number. You can even put in headings of the question numbers and rule off and so on. Remember, it's much easier and quicker to delete than it is to type in new stuff, so I suggest you set up a blank exam script template beforehand. Save yourself a minute or two during the exam. Then something quite important as well, point 8, is check that you know how to convert to PDF format prior to the exam. That applies particularly if you're handwriting any part of your exam. Make sure you've got an app that you can scan your script with and get it into PDF format for submission. You don't want to spend 2 hours on your exam and then find at the end that you can't convert it to PDF for submission. So make sure you know how to do that beforehand and test it to make sure that you can actually do it. Right, then looking at the actual paper. The scenario in this exam is actually quite simple and straightforward, but let's take a quick look at it. A large store currently sells only books and magazines. So there you have two objects already, books and magazines, and note that only books and magazines, although this may well be expanded to other items at some future point. While both books and magazines have a name, we also want to know the name of the book publisher and the magazine frequency. So you have two objects here which have a common property, and then each of them has an additional unique property. Then a master list of all books and items should be kept. Notice there all books and items. That suggests then that there's an items base class and that books and magazines are derived classes. So a master list should be kept, which should have all the functionality of a queue list. Now you must read this carefully. It should have all the functionality of a queue list. To me, that immediately suggests inheritance. In other words, this master list is a queue list. That suggests inheritance. Although I doubt that composition or aggregation would be marked wrong, it does seem to me that the preferred solution here is inheritance. The client, so there's another class you've got. The client then contains an instance of this list. So it contains an instance of this list. So there you're looking at a client class with a composition or aggregation relationship to this master list of all books and items. So the client contains an instance of this list which can be accessed by several functions in the client. So just reading the scenario, you should have been able to identify several classes already. There's a client class, there's books, magazines, and items. So books and magazines will inherit items, and then you also have a master list which have all the functionality of a queue list. So that's the scenario. Let's continue. Question 1, which is 30 marks. That's quite a big mark allocation. This is a very substantial part of the paper. So as I said, make sure you allocate the appropriate amount of time for a 30-mark question. Considering the scenario given above, draw a partial UML class diagram. Notice the wording here, a partial UML class diagram. So don't waste time putting in a whole lot of detail that's not required. It is a partial UML class diagram that captures the scenario. You should include the necessary classes, attributes, and class relationships that are mentioned in the scenario. So again, just to repeat, don't try and include anything that's not specifically mentioned in the scenario. You're wasting your time. Class constructors and member access specifiers are not required. Again, don't waste time putting constructors and trying to work out what should be private and public and protected and so on. It's not required. However, you should ensure that you include all the data members and member functions that show how data will be moved around the application. This is a very important part because this is what the examiner is actually trying to get from you, is that you understand how everything fits together and how all the different classes operate and work together. So this aspect of showing how data is moved around the application is quite important. So you do need to understand the relationships between the classes and how they interact with each other. And then it explicitly states that you should include the client GUI class. So I'll go through a suggested approach to drawing a UML class diagram. But let's just look at this part. You may use software tool to create the UML class diagram. So you can use any software tool. Again, to state the obvious, make sure you know how to use it before the exam. You don't want to try and figure out how to use a piece of software during your exam time. Then another suggestion, it might be worthwhile to prepare a document beforehand and add in several classes, 4, 5, 6 classes, because you know invariably you're going to require that. Again, it's easier just to delete things that you don't require than it is to add in new classes to a diagram. So as a suggestion, have a document ready before the exam that is set up so you don't waste time doing that during the exam. And it says use underlining to represent italics in hand-drawn UML class diagram. Just be careful about this requirement. Remember, in UML, underlining is used to show static. There is no static in this exam, so I'm not talking specifically for this exam, but in general for future exams. If you use underlining to represent italics and there's also static in the diagram, then you're going to have a problem. I'd suggest if you do have both in the same diagram that you use a straight line for static and a squiggly line for the italics or abstract items, and maybe just make a note on the side of the diagram to make it clear which is which. But just be careful about using this underlining to represent italics. Remember that UML actually uses underlining for static. Then the approach I suggest is to draw up a table similar to this with 4 columns, the class, relationships, methods, and properties. If you are going to use this method, I'd suggest you draw up a blank table before the exam so that it's ready and you can start filling in things. Again, you don't want to waste time drawing up tables and documents. Have it ready before the exam. But if you aren't going to use this kind of methodology to do it, I really strongly suggest that you do have a plan of action before the exam. Work out and be clear in your mind exactly how you're going to approach a scenario-based question like this. Don't have a look at your exam script, read the scenario and sit there thinking, well, oops, what should I do now? Have a plan of action ready before the exam. So if you don't use this methodology, at least have something of your own worked out and clear in your mind about how you're going to do it before the exam. You don't want to get your exam paper and read the scenario and sit there thinking, oops, what am I going to do now? Have a plan of action ready beforehand. So we have a table like this with our 4 columns, and the first step is to identify all the classes, relationships, methods, and data members required from the scenario. The first thing we had was that you had to include the client class, and you were also explicitly told that it must include a list of items. So that's one of the properties. So you have a composition or aggregation relationship, your client will have a list. We then have the item, which will be the base class for books and magazines. The scenario didn't explicitly say that it must be abstract, but it says that the shop can only sell books and magazines, so it can't sell items. So from that you should infer that your item should be abstract, so you can't instantiate objects of the item class. So item is your base class, and then had you don't have to specifically show constructors, but you do need to show the flow of data. And one way of getting data into your class is by using the constructor. An alternative here would be to use a setter, to have a set name method, which would be an acceptable alternative. So you must either show the constructor that takes an argument for the name, or put a setter to set the name. But you must show how the data gets into your item class. And it has one property, which is a QString name property. Then the derived classes were books and magazines. The relationship for both is inheritance to the base class. Then I've shown constructors for both of them that takes the name argument and also the attribute that's specific to them, the publisher's name for the book and the frequency for the magazine. Again, you can either do it through the constructor like this or put setters for those items so that that data can flow and get into the objects. Then they both have a unique property. A book has a publisher's name and a magazine has a frequency, and they're both Q strings. But you must show some way of moving the data into these objects, either through the constructor or with setters. Then the other class that was identified in the scenario was a list of the items, and as I said, the wording of the scenario suggests inheritance from QList, although you could also do composition or aggregation. And again, you need to handle the data flow, so you should have some kind of a method that will allow items to be added to the list. So there's a fairly simple scenario, 5 classes which should have been identified from that scenario. And step 2.1 is then to draw each of these classes with its relationships, methods, and properties, starting from the client, which is the basic one. So we have a client class which contains lists, so it's got a property. You'll notice I've shown the access specifiers, which the question said you are not required to show. It's simply because I use Visual Paradigm to draw the diagrams and it puts them in by default. But you're not actually required to show those access specifiers, but you will see them here because they're simply put in by default. Next step then, we add in the item list class. So we have our client, and then we have the item list. You could show composition or aggregation. There's nothing in the scenario that suggests composition. Or to put it slightly differently, one of the tests is, can the item list exist separate from the client? And the obvious answer is yes, so that suggests aggregation and not composition. And then in turn, the item list, I've shown inheritance from a queue list of item pointers. You could also show composition aggregation relationship there. That would also be correct, although to me the wording of the scenario does suggest inheritance. In other words, the item list is a list as opposed to has a list. Then the next thing we add in is our item class, which is the base class for the books and magazines. Again, the item list is composed of or aggregation of items. You could argue that because they're pointers, it's composition, and the list has to be responsible for deleting the pointers, but there's nothing in the scenario that specifies that, so it could be composition or aggregation. Just as a general note, if you're not sure, if it's not explicitly stated in the scenario, always go for aggregation. Aggregation is the safer option. Only show composition if it is sort of explicitly given in the scenario. Then the next item then is to add in the 2 derived classes. So we have the derived book and magazine with the inheritance relationship, and then we've included the attributes and constructors as required in the scenario. Just to repeat again, you weren't specifically required to show the constructors. They're only using here to show the flow of data. You could have put setters here as an alternative to populate the attributes of those two classes. So that is the partial UML diagram. It's relatively straightforward. It's a lot simpler than it has been in past years, but you shouldn't have any real problems in dealing with this. So moving on, question 1.2. Consider the two partial UML classes depicted below. So we have two different item classes here. One, you'll notice that the attribute is private and the other one is protected. Explain what the difference is between them and the effect this will have on the rest of the application when dealing with books and magazines. 3 marks. Answer. As I've just said, the name attribute is private. In other words, that's the minus access specifier in the first one, and protected, the hash sign access specifier in the second one. You would then need to give an explanation, something along the following lines. The private attribute can only be accessed from within the item class. The protected attribute can be accessed from any classes that inherit the item class. So the access specifier for the name attribute should be the hash protected, so that it can be accessed by any derived classes, book and magazine, and any others that are added later. This is quite an important consideration when dealing with inheritance. It's a very common mistake. Your attributes in your base class generally should be protected so that they're accessible from the derived classes. Don't make them private, otherwise you're going to have problems accessing your data from the derived classes. But that briefly is the difference between private and protected. Any kind of explanation that explains that issue would get 2 marks. But generally it needs to be protected so it's accessible from the derived classes, and private wouldn't be accessible from the derived classes. In question 1.3, should the item class be abstract? Note that marks are only allocated for explaining your reason. The answer to that is yes. Users should not be able to instantiate objects of the item base class, only objects of the derived book and magazine classes. Items are not sold in the store, only books and magazines. So users should not be able to instantiate items because they are not sold in the store, only books and magazines. And the way you prevent those items from being instantiated is by making the class abstract. So that should get you 3 marks. In question 1.4, it was decided to use a factory method pattern when creating items for the store list. The following UML class diagram was provided. Anyone familiar with the factory method will immediately note that that diagram is completely incorrect. If this representation is correct, explain in detail how the creation of items is implemented. Fill in details that may be missing from the UML class diagram provided. If this representation is not correct, redraw the UML class diagram. As I said, it's obviously incorrect, so we're going to have to redraw the diagram. It would then look something like this. Just as an explanation, I've used exactly the same diagram that we had previously. The client item list, queue list, item base class, book and magazine is all exactly the same as it was before. All we've done here is to add in an item factory along with the create item method, which takes the given parameters. And then the relations are that the client uses the item factory. In other words, it just instantiates an item factory object as and when required, instantiates the object and then disposes of it. The item factory in turn uses the item base class because it returns an item pointer. So it obviously needs to use the item class for that. Sorry, something I've just noticed, the item class should have been abstract. This item should have been in italics. I haven't included that in this diagram, and that's because there was no pure virtual method in the base class, but it should actually be an abstract class. Then the item factory in turn creates the derived classes, book and magazine respectively. So to get your marks, all you had to do was add in the item factory class, and the client uses relationship, the item factory uses item relationship, and that creates a relationship to the books and magazines. But that's just the basic standard implementation of the factory method. Question 1.5. The plan is to include an item code for each item that adheres to the following format. So the code must start with either book, BK, or MG for a magazine. It must have a number in the range from 0 to 399. It takes up 3 positions in the code, so it must always have the leading zeros. And just a word generally about regular expressions. You need to understand, when dealing with regular expressions like this, you always process character by character. You cannot handle a code saying 0 to 399. You've got to handle the first character, which can be a 0 to 3, the second character, which can be 0 to 9, and the third character, which can be 0 to 9. When dealing with regular expressions, you go character by character, not 0 to 399. You must then have an underscore, and then 1 or 2 lowercase alphabetic characters, where the final character should not be a vowel. There should be no other characters before or after this code. So remember, you've got an optional possible 2 last characters, where one of them is optional and the final one should not be a vowel. So if there's only one character, that it can't be a vowel. If there's 2 characters, then it's the final one that can't be a vowel. So just be careful how that is processed. And then carries on with a Q regular expression will be used to ensure that the string matches the required format. Then you're given Q regular expression. What would you put here? And you need to be very careful about this. Q regular expression takes a Q string argument. So it's a Q string. It means it can be enclosed in quotes. And because it's a string, then you need to escape any backslashes or regex meta characters. So you need to be very clear in these exam questions whether your required answer is in a string format or just a plain regex. If it's in a string, you need to show the inverted commas and you need to escape backslashes and meta characters. Just be careful about that and don't leave out the extra backslashes escapes when required. Okay, question 151. Write down what you would provide in the comment in the code above. As I said, just make sure you include the quotes and everything else that follows that. As I've said, the Q regular expression constructor requires a Q string argument and the answer must be enclosed in quotes. Any backslashes or meta characters must be escaped. Then just a note here, I've included spaces in the regex purely for legibility. Don't put them in when you're answering, otherwise you'll end up with a regex that accepts blank spaces, literal blank spaces all over the place. So the first thing is to note is we have the 2 quotes as required. And then, because our code must be standalone and not a substring, we've got the beginning and end anchors, the caret at the beginning and the $sign at the end. And that ensures that there'll be nothing before or after the code. Then going through each item in turn, the way we handle the requirement to show either BK or MG for book or magazine is to use the regex, the pipe character, which is an OR in regex. So what and it's enclosed in parentheses. So we have either BK or MG. It's one or the other, not both. And that's how we handle that. Then the numerical requirement of 000 to 399. The first character can be 0 to 3, so we have a range of 0 to 3. Then the second character is 09 to 9 range, and the third character is also 0 to 9, so we handle that by having the 2 multiplier in braces, so it's 2 instances of 0 to 9. There's then a literal underscore. Then we have to have 2 alphabetic characters, lowercase, at the end. And the last one cannot be a vowel, it must be a consonant. So the way we do that is by having a range of A to Z for any lowercase letter. Then we use the question mark multiplier, which means 0 or 1. So basically, our second to last character is optional. If it's included, it can be a lowercase A to Z, or it may be excluded, 0 instances. Then the last character must be an alphabetic consonant, not a vowel, and the only way to handle that is by explicitly putting in the ranges B to D, F to H, J to N, P to T, and V to Z. You cannot use the negative or negate not A, E, I, O, U in a range. It won't work because that will allow numbers and special characters. So you can't use this not A, E, I, O, U. You have to explicitly state the allowable ranges. There's no short way of doing that. So that basically is the regex that would be required to answer this question, and that would get you 7 marks. Okay, then question 152, which would be better to use to validate the code when a user enters it on the GUI, a regular expression or an input mask. Use an example from the required code format to show why you say so. The mark is only awarded for the explanation, and that's the usual case in COS3711 exam. You do need to be able to explain what you're doing to show that you understand what it is, not just saying yes or no or something along those lines. And the answer in this case would clearly be a regular expression, for the simple reason that an input mask cannot handle all the requirements. For example, input mask has no equivalent of the regex or operand to handle the book or magazine, and cannot process that requirement to start with the book or magazine. The input mask also cannot handle the requirement to exclude vowels. It can only require or make an alphabetic character optional. In other words, if you have a capital A in the input mask, it means that an alphabetical character is required, or if it's a lowercase a, it is allowed but not required. So an input mask can only handle either an alphabetic character is required or it's optional, but it cannot handle things like specifying a specific range or not a vowel or including specifically BK or MG. It's either character is required or it isn't, or it's optional. And it does have the ability, of course, to make it upper or lowercase, but it cannot handle any kind of logic like BK or MG, for example. And the logic to handle excluding vowels. So an input mask is generally a very simplistic means of validation where a regex can handle quite complex logic. But yeah, the answer would be regular expression and then some kind of discussion and example on why an input mask is inadequate. But it's only 1 mark, so don't waste too much time on it. Now, question 2, 25 marks. Consider the individual and corporate customers that the store serves. Then you're giving the header for the customer class. It should be very obvious just by glancing at it that this is a very badly designed class. You've got XML readers and writers. You've got a list of customer pointers, and you should be thinking on why on earth would a customer object want to keep lists of other customer objects, and can it include itself in that list, for example. So basically you've got a very badly designed customer class. And then you're also given the declarations for the individual and corporate classes which inherit customers. Question 2.1. Comment on the structure and content of the customer class, providing reasons for your assessment. Again, notice that the question explicitly states provide reasons for your assessment. It's the reasons that are important. You do need to show your understanding of what you're doing. And the answer would be something along these lines. It's a very poorly designed class. Right? It's an anti-pattern, and I think this is specifically what the question is asking about, the anti-pattern. It's a God object. It has too many responsibilities. The XML reader and writer methods, and the list should all be in separate classes. Just remember the single purpose principle. A class should do one thing and one thing only. It's just too much responsibility for a class to be a customer object and also read XML and write XML and handle lists of customers. It's far too much responsibility for one class. So it's an anti-pattern. It's a God object with too many responsibilities. So any discussion along those lines would get you your 2 marks. In question 2.2, the customer class represents an implementation of the serializer pattern. Explain in detail why you do or do not agree. It's only 2 marks. Okay, the answer is no, it does not represent an implementation of the serializer pattern. And the discussion is that the serializer pattern requires separate read and write classes, not read and write methods within a class. So it's just simply not the appropriate structure for the serializer pattern, which in any event should be in separate classes. And as I mentioned previously, what we're talking about here is basically the single purpose principle, or as it's sometimes stated, the separation of concerns. So the serializer pattern requires separate classes for reading and writing, not read and write methods within the same class. So customer class is not an implementation of the serializer pattern. Question 2.3. The list data member contains pointers to customer objects. Explain why this is necessary. 2 marks. This question paper's got a lot of explaining to do for relatively few marks. Answer. The list is required to store objects of different types. That's the derived classes of individual and corporate, which is not possible with a QList template. Generally speaking, it cannot handle objects of different types within the template. While I'm saying this, I can't help thinking if it would be possible with QVariant. Maybe, but I'm not sure. We'd have to look into that. But generally, your QList cannot handle objects of different types. However, in C++, a pointer to a base class can point to objects of any of its derived classes. So objects of different types can be stored by using a base class customer pointer in the list. So by using a pointer to your base class, you would be able to effectively store the different types of individual and corporate objects in the same list. So that's one way of getting around the strong typing of C++ language, is that a pointer to a base class can point to objects of any of its derived classes. And that gives you a means of having a list that can effectively store objects of different types. So again, some kind of discussion around that would get you your 2 marks. Question 2.4. Write the implementation code for the parameterized customer constructor and destructor following good OOP programming practice. So you need to know your OOP programming practice to answer this part of the question. And the answer would be something along these lines. You would have your customer constructor with your name argument. Then you need to do the initialization in the initialization section of the constructor, the colon, then your name, and you pass in the value from the argument, then separated by a comma. Then your list, you would have declared that list in the header. You then need to initialize the list by calling new on it. You don't want to have uninitialized pointers in your class because that will cause some major problems. And note that there's no comma or semicolon or anything after the last item. Then the important part of this question, in your destructor, you need to handle all the pointers, and we've got 2. We have a queue list which contains customer pointers, and the list itself is a pointer. So there's 2 lots of pointers that you need to deal with. And the way of handling the list is by calling queue delete all on the list. Notice that you must dereference the list by like that. Remember, you want to call queue delete all on the object that the list is pointing to, not on the pointer. So you do need to dereference the list pointer. So that handles all the pointers that are stored in the list, and then you need to call delete on the list pointer itself. And that will handle all the pointers that are in this class. So that would be your implementation of the customer constructor and destructor. Then, assuming that the XML string is in the following format, you're then given basic XML format. Note the root object is customers plural. You then have customer elements which have type attribute, and depending on the value of that attribute, you have different types of customers and have slightly different child elements. But that's a fairly basic XML format. Then consider the code below for the list from XML function, and where there are errors in the code, correct them, and add code where indicated by comments, and add the customer to the list in the appropriate place in the function. So that's what we need to do to sort out this XML. You may assume that the list will be empty and that there will only be 2 types of customers, but you cannot assume that the tags for a customer will always have the name tag first. So you need to be able to process the elements in any order. You can't assume that the name will always come up first, although it appears first in the XML sample you're given. As it turns out, that's actually not much of a complication at all. Then if you're using a word processor, you may copy the code into your answer document and make the necessary changes. As a suggestion here, it might be better to copy it into Qt and use that because it handles the formatting and coloring in that better than a word processor would. You are allowed to use Qt during the exam and use the Qt help and all of that. Okay, then we are given this code. I'm not going to go through this in detail. Yeah, you should have the question paper, and it is basically repeated in the solution on the next page, but you're given basically code using QDOM document. You notice the first thing is that we have a list from XML method that has a QString argument S, and that is actually our first error. You will notice that the set content method here used an XML string reference. So that's obviously the first error. Set content must be called on S. Sorry, I just want to go back a line. This Q list here, just ignore that. I actually added that in to be able to process this code in Qt. It couldn't handle it if I used the list as part of the customer class. I had to use a separate list class. I should actually have deleted that line when I copied this code across, but I forgot to do it. So just ignore this Q list here and just assume that we've got a list included with a lowercase l. So we have this first statement, doc set content. The first thing that's wrong is that the argument is incorrect. It's S and not XML string. And also there was a not document set content, which is incorrect. If it is in fact not set content, in other words, if our DOM document object cannot set the content, what you must either do is return, because there's no good continuing processing if your QDOM document can't actually read the input, or else you must remove that not, because what you wanted to do is process here if it does set content. So either remove the not operator or else add a return if setting the document fails from this point. So it's basically two errors in the first line. The S argument, you must process the input to the method, and it's also not a reference. So that's two things you have to correct right up front. Then retrieving our root element. The correct method is document element, not root element. So that was another error that had to be corrected. Just most of the errors I've indicated using ER for error just to save space. So this was another one. You had to put in document element and not root element. Then processing further, if the root tag name is customers, notice the root is customers plural with the S, not customer singular. Customer as a child element of root, so you had to correct that as well, make it customers plural. We then continue processing. We want to extract our elements. Remember that when processing DOM, you declare a node, and you've effectively got to, everything in DOM is a node, but to actually use it, you've got to convert it to an element. So you get your node, you then convert it to an element by calling the toElement method, which was also incorrect in the given code. See, I just had element and not toElement. So that's another error that had to be corrected. It's toElement, not just element. Then moving down, if the element tag name, its customer is what's required to equate it to not customer type as it had in the given code. then we want to extract the type, which is the attribute in the code given. We want to extract the name, and then the second element, which is different for each, whether it's individual or corporate, but we can just use one common string, which I've called other. In the attribute statement in the code, they left out the type parameter, so you need to add in type there. You can't just call attribute by itself. You've got to specify which attribute is required, so that's another error in the given code. We then start processing the children of our customer element, and this is the important part of the code, is get the tag values for this customer. Again, we have our DOM node, which is normal. We want to convert that into an element. Again, we need to call the toElement method, not what was given in the code you had. And then this next part is fairly important. This is how we handle processing the elements in any order. We simply have an if statement for each one. We have here if element tag name is equal to name. Following that, we have if element tag name is equal to ID number or reg number, depending on if it's corporate or individual, but we can use the same variable name to store those values. So that will process that requirement in any order. It doesn't matter if name comes first or name comes second. We're going through a loop. It will process whichever one pops up in any order. So if our element tag name is name, we have our name QString, and we call the text method of QDOM element. That gives us the element value. In other words, the value between the start and end tags. Then we do the same for the ID number or reg number tags. We can just use the same variable number and name for it, and we extract the text that is between the start and end tags. And then we want to remember we're in a loop here. We want to process the next element. The correct method to call is next sibling element, not next tag as it was given to you. So that's another item that you have to correct. Then once we've looped through and extracted all the element values, we want to instantiate our customer objects and add them to the list. So we declare a pointer to a customer object, and then if the type is equal to individual, we call new individual, and we pass the required parameters into the constructor. So we now have our customer pointer pointing to an individual object if the type is individual. Else, if the type is equal to corporate, we call the corporate constructor and pass in the appropriate values. Then an important thing to do here is, if by some chance our type isn't individual or corporate, and calling new won't happen, you must assign a null pointer to your customer. You don't want to try and add an uninitialized pointer to your list, because your app will crash very badly. So once we've instantiated our corporate and individual objects, we just call the append method of our list to add them into our list, and then we continue looping until we've processed everything in the XML. At the end here, we get all of that processing so far has been one customer, so we now want to loop through to the next customer. And the correct method to call here is next sibling element, not just next sibling. So that, in theory, or in fact, is the processing that's required in order to read in that XML to the list. It's actually quite a bit of work for one question, and it's not absolutely straightforward. It's quite easily confused with this. So just make sure you know before the exam how to process DOM using QDOM document and also using the QML, the QTXML stream reader and stream writer, because it'll turn. Some exams ask you DOM document, other exams ask you XML stream reader and writer. Just make sure you know how to handle both of them, reading and writing. I'd suggest you prepare some example code beforehand that you can refer to, because you will invariably get a question on XML in the exam. So it's something you do need to be prepared for. Okay, question 3, 18 marks. Okay, the mark allocations are reducing. The customer list, which is implemented as a list of customer pointers, as in question 2, is to be displayed on the GUI using a model view approach. The following model is required. So it's a Q standard item model, and it's declared in the normal way. Then the interface should look as follows. I think it's quite obvious from that we're dealing with a Q table view. Notice a slight potential complication here. It displays individual and corporate objects, but they have different properties. So your individual objects displays in the first 3 columns, and your corporate objects has a blank column 3 and then has an entry in column 4, whereas the individual one has a blank column. In fact, I should say column 3, because it obviously starts from 0 at 0, 1, 2, 3. So you do need to be able to handle those blank cells when processing these. Question 3.1. As a pointer has been used for the model above, describe how the allocated memory will be freed and where the responsibility for this lies, indicating why this is so. Okay, there's two possible answers to this question. The first way of doing it is to add this pointer to the constructor. Remember that all your models Q standard item model inherits Q objects. So as with all Q objects, it can take a parent pointer. So the one way of handling this is to add this pointer to the Q standard item model constructor, as I've shown with this code, and you can do it for the model and the view. Your views also take a parent pointer. And the explanation of this is that this uses Qt's parent-child relationship, and the parent then becomes responsible for the destruction of the child objects when it is destroyed. And this is Qt's implementation of the composite pattern, where the parent becomes responsible for all of its child objects. The alternative is to explicitly call delete on the pointer in the client destructor. This explicitly frees heap memory, and the responsibility for doing this then is that of the programmer. The programmer needs to explicitly handle freeing up the allocated memory. So you just need to have a destructor, and you call delete on the model pointer, and you call delete on the view pointer. So your alternatives is allowing Qt's parent-child relationship and the composite pattern to automatically handle the deletion of the pointers to free up the memory, or else alternatively you do it explicitly in the destructor, where you explicitly call delete on each of the pointers in turn. Question 3.2. Using an appropriate view for this model, declare the view and ensure that the model data will be visible in the view. So we declare our Q standard item model in the normal way. So it's quite clear that it's a Q table view. We declare our pointer and call new on the table view, and then we just call the set model a method of QTable view and pass in the model pointer as an argument, and that is actually all that's required. I've just shown this additional code for a fuller example, because the example table you were given actually showed the headers. So it's questionable whether you need to include that, because it says use an appropriate view, declare the view. So if you want to declare the view as it's shown in the example, you would need to declare the headers. And the way you do that is by declaring a string list, then just adding in the actual headers for each column, and then call the set horizontal header labels method of your model, and that will set the headers. This additional code isn't required, but it's always a good idea to resize the columns to content, so you make sure that everything's visible and not partly hidden away. And then it's also a good idea to set the stretch on the last section so that the last column expands to the full width of the view, and you don't end up with a big blank section on the right. But so these last 3 lines are really just for information. But I think what is required is just this showing how to call the set model method and pass the model in as an argument on the view. And as the question is not, the question, should I say, is probably not totally clear, but I think it's probably a good idea to show the headers, because the question does ask you how to declare the view, and presumably it should be the same as the example that's given. But yeah, it's the set model method that is the important part. Question 3.3. The customer class would have to be reflective to allow code to determine what type of instance the customer pointer in the customer list is pointing to. Rewrite the customer class so that it would allow for such reflective programming approaches to be used. You need not include all the functions and data members in rewriting the class that are not part of implementing reflection. That's only 1 mark. It's actually quite a bit of work for 1 mark. So let's go through it. The first thing is to implement reflection is you must inherit QObject. So that's the first thing. You must then include the QObject macro. That's essential for implementing reflection. Then the QProperty macro itself, it's in the normal format. You declare the type, a QString, then the name of the property, which in this case is also a name. We're going to want to write this property, so we reference the setter, set name. Notice we have a set name setter in our customer class. And notice when you're doing the QProperty macro, you only put the name of the setter. There's no parenthesis or arguments or anything. It's just set name. You don't include those parentheses or the arguments. Then for the read part of it, you reference the getter, which is just get name. Again, there's no parenthesis or anything. But you will notice that your getter is constant, so you have to include the constant. Then likewise for the list, we've got a list property, and it's a pointer to a QList. So we use our QProperty macro. We put the type, which is a QList of customer pointers, and it is itself a pointer, so don't leave that out. Its name is list, which is the same as we have in our customer class. And it's a read-only property, and we reference therefore the getList getter. So that is what is required. Now, strictly speaking, the only part you need to add to implement reflection is this first bit, the inheritance from QObject, the QObject macro, and the 2 QProperty macros. But this question is in my mind, not totally clear. You need not include the function and dart members when rewriting the class that are not part of implementing reflection. But these getters and setters and these properties are in fact required to implement reflection. If you leave them out, reflection won't work. So although the only changes required to the class are adding these macros and the inheritance, if you leave any of the rest of this out, reflection won't work. So strictly speaking, everything else here is actually required to implement reflection. So leaving that out is not actually correct, although I suspect the question wasn't actually intended to include all that. You actually have to include it, otherwise reflection wouldn't work. So that's a lot of work for 1 mark. Just notice a common mistake here. The Q property, it's a Qt macro, it's not Qt code, so there's no semicolon on the end of that line. It's not critical if you do include it, it's just not necessary. It won't crash or anything, but just make sure you understand the difference between a QObject macro and Qt code. But that's basically what's required to implement reflection. And so the important parts are inheriting QObject, the QObject macro, and then the QProperty macros, including all the required information. That's the important part. But as in strictly speaking, everything else has to be included here. For instance, you can't reference a setter set name and then not include the set name setter. So strictly speaking, everything else here is actually required to implement reflection. Okay, question 3.4. Using the code stub below, expand the code so that it would add each customer item to the model. Now, to put it bluntly, this is not a very well structured exam paper. Strictly speaking, this question is impossible to answer. To expand the code so it would add each customer item to the model. Now you declare customer object, and then you immediately call the get list method of customer. Given this code, that list will always be empty. There's no way of populating it. So there's no way of adding each customer item to the model because you're working with a list that's always going to be empty. But for purposes of answering this, let's assume that there is in fact some way of populating that list. Notice that the code and the question only requires to add things after, well, from the loop onwards. What you should in fact do is between these lines here is populate that list in some way by calling, for example, the read XML code, but that's not actually stated in the question. So it's a 12-mark question, which, as I strictly speaking, there's no actual answer to with what you're given. You actually do need to populate that list before it. But let's assume that that complication doesn't exist. Okay, so we, as I've just said, with the code you're given, that list will always be empty. Sorry, I'll sort my mouse out one day. Okay, I've declared the QString class name outside of the loop because that's more efficient. You could actually put that inside the loop. It just means that on every iteration you will declare an object again. And if you've got a list 100 items on, you're doing 100 declarations and calling constructors, that's not actually required. You can simply just assign it a different value on each iteration. But you could declare that class name and QString inside or outside the loop either. Okay, then in order to get this example to work, I used an external list class entirely. I didn't use the list that was in the customer class. So in fact, this little bit of code that I've got there isn't required. What you would actually use is just this list that's been declared there, and remember, you must dereference it. You want to loop through the object that the pointer is pointing to. You don't want to loop through the pointer. So you would have customer, you would declare customer with a customer pointer, and then the dereferenced list for that second part. So your answer would actually be slightly different to what I've got shown there. Unfortunately, when dealing with Q standard items, it's quite laborious. For each row that's going to appear in your table, you need to declare a list of Q standard item pointers. So the first thing we do is declare that list, which are called item list, and then we've got to go through and instantiate each of our Q standard items and append them to the list. Then the way we retrieve the class name is because we've implemented reflection with our customer class, and we use the meta object, Q meta object, to extract the class name. So we call the meta object method of Q object. Remember, customer inherits Q object, and then once we've got the meta object, that has a class name method that we can call, and that returns the class name as a Q string. You don't have to do this and chain it like this in one line. You could declare a constant Q meta object meta, get the meta object, and then have a separate line and call the class name on the meta object. So doing that in one or two lines would both be acceptable. I just think it's easier and neater to chain it like this and do it all in one go, but you could separate declaring the meta object and then using the meta object to extract the class name in two separate lines. We then have to go through declaring a Q standard item pointer for each item that we want to include. So we declare a pointer for the type and we pass in the class name. We then append that item to the item list that we declared previously, and that being the first item, that will populate the first column in our table. You don't have to use this overloaded operand like this. You can call the append method of QList to append the items into the list. Both would be acceptable. We then declare a Q standard item for the name, and we call the get name method on our customer pointer. We then append that name to the list. And then it gets a bit more complicated because we're dealing with two different types of objects which have different properties. Remember, our individual has different properties compared to corporate objects. And we can't rely on polymorphism here. For example, for our individual objects, we want to get the ID number, but there is no corresponding virtual get ID number method in the customer base class. So we can't use polymorphism to call the appropriate methods at runtime. And if you use a customer pointer to try and call the get ID number method in the individual class, you will get an error to say there is no such method. To be able to get to the get ID number method, which is unique to your individual class, you have to use a pointer to an individual object. And the way around that is that we need to cast our customer pointer to an individual pointer. So you could use dynamic cast. Static cast would probably work as well. Excuse me. But this is basically how we cast the customer pointer to an individual pointer. That then allows us to call the get ID number method and that's how we get our ID standard item, and we append that to the list. Likewise, if our class name is corporate, we want to get the registration number, but get reg number is a method that's unique to the corporate class. There's no corresponding virtual method in the customer base class, so we can't use polymorphism. Again, we have to cast our customer pointer to a corporate class pointer, and that then allows us to call the get reg number method. Now remember the complication that I mentioned earlier. Our corporate objects in the table view, the third column is blank. So we can't just add this directly to the list. If we add our reg number to the list at this stage, it will appear in the third column, and we don't want that. We want it to appear in the fourth column. And the way we handle that is by inserting a blank Q standard item. And the way you get a blank item is just by calling the default constructor. That will give you effectively a blank Q standard item. So we first append the blank Q standard item to our item list. That will effectively make the cell in the third column blank. And we then append the registration number to the item list, which will then put that into the fourth column where it's supposed to be. We then call the append row method of our model, and we pass in this item list that we've now constructed, and that is how we get everything into the model. This last line is not actually required, but it's always a good idea to call this resize columns to contents, just to make sure everything is displayed and you don't have part of the contents required. But that line's not actually required to answer this question. And then just to repeat again, instead of using these overloaded operators, you can just call the append method to append items to the list. That is basically how you process this and read the items into the model. But the tricky part of this was this casting of pointers, because we're not dealing with polymorphism here. So you need to be able to access the appropriate methods which are unique to the derived classes. So this casting of pointers was quite an important aspect of this question. And question 4, which is only 7 marks. Each sale made in store is recorded as a transaction. Then we're given a basic transaction class with a pointer that takes some arguments, and then a get backup method which returns some type, and then we are given some attributes, a customer name, a date, and a list of items, which is books or magazines that the customer has purchased. When the client application creates a transaction, it also requests a backup of that instance to hold in memory. We're then given a transaction constructor T, and it says parameters be passed to the constructor object, which is a bit silly because we were actually given what the exact items are above there. I don't know why it was necessary to add that complication when you were actually explicitly given it. Okay, then the wording of this question. Again, sorry to be critical, but it's rather poorly worded. We're obviously heading to memento pattern here. Requests a backup of that instance to hold in memory. Memento pattern is not a backup. Memento pattern is a do-undo facility. So using the word backup here with memento pattern is, not, strictly speaking, not correct. But anyway, this is a question that's dealing with the memento pattern. So consider the implementation of this backup, or should be do-undo functionality, when appropriate design pattern would be used to ensure that the data in the backup is not accessible by the client. And that's another clue that we're dealing with the memento pattern. Remember, it's a very important aspect of the memento pattern that it preserves encapsulation, and then it also very fortunately, as it turns out, says that you do not need to consider restoring from the backup, because there's actually quite a complication with that, because we're passing in three parameters here. It's quite easy to pass them in, it's not so easy to get them out. Okay, question 4.1.1. Write the class header for the class that would support this backup functionality. Okay, again, I have a bit of a problem with this question. Write the class header for the class that would support this backup functionality. We're dealing with the memento pattern. Now, to implement the memento pattern, you require three classes. That's the actual memento, the originator, and the caretaker. So a question that says to write the header for the class that would support this backup functionality is not strictly correct. To implement the memento pattern, you actually need three classes. Again, to answer the question, we'll assume that we're dealing with the actual memento, which is what I think they actually mean here. But yeah, strictly speaking, it's poorly worded. So we're going to write the we're going to write the header here for a memento class. Okay, you must give it some appropriate name. The sort of norm is just to add the word memento to the name of your originator class. So you would have transaction memento, but any reasonable name that includes or indicates that you're dealing with the actual memento would do here. Now, the important thing in dealing with the memento class is that everything is private. That is actually the most important aspect of the memento. Now, in answering this question, just ignore the struct that I've put in here, because it did explicitly say you don't have to be able to restore the backup. Something I didn't put in here, which in retrospect I probably should have, I've left out the word private, and the simple reason for that is because a class is always private by default. So if you don't put in public, private, or protected, it will always be private by default. But it would, in retrospect, have been better to explicitly put private here, just to indicate that you do understand that everything in the memento is private. So what you need in your memento class is obviously the constructor, which, as I've said, must be private. Then you need to declare the originator class as a friend. So you put friend class transaction, because the transaction is the originator. That is the class that you're making the so-called backup of, or the class that you are saving the state of. For answering this question, you don't need the getter, because you don't have to be able to restore the state. Then we need a setter. You need to be able to set the state, and that includes the three arguments: the name, the date, and the list of items. Then the other thing is that you need a means of storing the state within the memento. As I said, I've used a struct because that's the easiest way to do it, but you could have just put a queue string, a queue date, and a queue list there to store the state. But you need some means of storing the state within the memento. That's the state of the originator, by the way. So as long as you indicate some means of storing a state, that would be fine. Now, the reason I actually put the structure, as I say, which is not actually required to answer this question, is that it's very easy to set the state with a queue string, a queue date, and a queue list. You can simply pass them in as arguments. But the getter, to get state, to return three different data types, is not easy. You can't do them individually. And the only way I could think of to actually do that is by using a struct, because then you can include a queue string, a queue date, and a queue list. As I said, I'm stating this for information. You don't actually need it to answer the question, but that is how you would handle the situation where you have multiple different data types to be stored within your memento. As just to make it clear, to answer the question, you don't need that struct, and you don't need the get state method either, but you need everything else that I've included here. Just to go over that again, you need a class that indicates that it is the memento, and it's preferable to indicate that it's a memento of the originator, so something like transaction memento or trans memento would be fine. It would probably be better to explicitly state private here. Then you must have the private constructor. You must declare your originator as a friend class transaction. Then you must have a setter to set the state and to pass in the 3 required data items. And then you must have a means of storing the state. And as I said, you could have had separate QString, QDate, and QList to do that. But that is a basic header for a memento pattern, the actual memento. And just to say again, as I said before, strictly speaking, for the implementation of, or the headers for the memento pattern, you actually need 3 classes, not just one. So the wording of the question's not ideal. Okay, 412, indicate what type would be used in the code fragment above for some type. The answer would be the memento itself. So again, whatever name you chose for your memento class would be the answer. As say transaction memento, trans memento, or something like that. It doesn't have to be a pointer, incidentally. That's not actually required. It would be best to make a pointer, so you are just passing references around and not big objects, but that's not required for the question. So the answer here is you just got to indicate that it's your actual memento is the type that is being returned. The little question, add-on question for 2 marks. Cloud computing takes on the shared responsibility model. What 2 features are the responsibility of the cloud provider? It's a bit of a vague question because shared responsibility models can vary in different responsibilities depending on the agreement between the parties. But features that the cloud provider would basically always provide would be anything to do with the physical assets, the physical hosts, the computers, the physical network, and the physical data center. So any 2 along those lines would be the appropriate answer for this question. But as a shared responsibility model can vary, so there are other items that could appropriately be included here. But basically the ones I've listed here are the ones that the cloud provider would always provide. Okay, that then is the October-November 2023 COS3711 past paper. I hope you found that useful. Thank you.